This might sound like a modern question, but it really isn't. Craving sex without making babies isn't some fresh product of the 20th century or some sexual revolution or even inventing the birth control pill. Honestly, it's one of the oldest human desires on record, and our wild attempts to chase that urge, trying to find ways to prevent pregnancy on purpose, goes back way further than most folks realize. Documented across ancient cultures and eras with a regularity that shows this was never some minor concern. It was universal. Humans have always desperately wanted to control when they reproduce. The actual approaches they tried ranged from the shockingly effective to the genuinely bizarre to the philosophically inventive. Some of these worked, while some really did not. But the history of what our ancestors try, why they did it, and how well they succeeded tells us a lot about how early humans understood their bodies, their surrounding world, and the subtle connection between both. So, let's start with the oldest evidence, because it is far older than most people would expect. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical scroll dating to around 1825 BCE, contains what's likely the oldest written contraceptive recipes in existence, and these recipes detail using a pessary, basically an early physical barrier, made of crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough and inserted before sex. Another recipe calls for a mix of honey and natron, a sodium carbonate salt used heavily in Egyptian holy rites and daily life. Crocodile dung as birth control. I need to sit with that before we move on. Like, did ancient Egyptians look at, faced with unwanted pregnancies, they asked, what if we tried crocodile poop? And modern chemistry actually tells us that this wild method might have actually worked a bit. Crocodile dung is alkaline, and highly alkaline zones are incredibly hostile to sperm, which prefer a slightly acidic home. Fermented dough only boosted that block. Sure, it was hardly a reliable birth control method, but this was not just superstitious nonsense. It was actually an effort to apply basic chemical logic to biology, using whatever raw materials they could find. In a world where crocodiles were apparently everywhere, they had a very steady supply of ingredients on repeat. Their honey and natron recipe was actually pretty clever from a chemical perspective. Honey has natural germ-fighting and sperm-killing traits that modern science has actually proven. Natron is highly alkaline. Neither trick is completely reliable, but they did something, given the limited options they had back then. In 1825 BC, they showed early science-based medicine targeted at family planning, using the tiny medical toolkit of their ancient world, and desperately trying to make something that actually worked. That is way more than you can say for most ancient medicine. And Egypt was not alone. Ancient Mesopotamian tablets also mention various birth control recipes. Early Indian writings from the Ayurvedic tradition lay out several ways to prevent pregnancy, including herbal oils used right before intimacy, alongside different herbal blends swallowed as tea. Even ancient Chinese medical scrolls agree. Same story there. It's a constant pattern. Wherever humans started writing things down, they wrote about birth control, meaning stopping unwanted pregnancies was happening way before history was ever written down. But how deep do these roots actually go? And how on earth do we prove something from before written records? How do we find prehistoric clues? That's tough. Yet, ancient bones tell stories. The biology is incredibly revealing and quite surprising. Looking at ancient human skeletons, scientists noticed something. There was a major gap between babies, a gap much wider than if nature was running wild. At maximum physical capacity, early hunter-gatherer mothers, judging by the bones, had spaced out pregnancies. They spaced their children by 3 to 4 years, instead of the biological maximum of 1 or 2. Part of this comes down to long breastfeeding, which delays fertility by keeping hormones in check. Another big factor is having low body fat from active lifestyles, which naturally reduces fertility. That makes sense, but researchers think there is more to this prehistoric puzzle. They point to deliberate efforts to delay next pregnancy intentionally. This wasn't just random luck. They were actively managing this using every bit of ancient knowledge at hand, and nature provided the most fascinating secrets of all. The proof actually exists across a massive range of diverse indigenous cultures on every inhabited continent studied by plant scientists and anthropologists over the past 150 years. We find a shockingly consistent body of knowledge about herbs with preventative, abortion, or fertility-altering properties. The exact herbs vary by region because the plants in sub-Saharan Africa are different from those in North America or Southeast Asia, but the types of plants used and the ways they are used show incredible similarities across cultures that had zero contact with each other at all. This overlap is definitely no coincidence. It actually proves that plant secondary metabolites, those defense chemicals that plants make for their own biological needs, like fighting off bugs and fungal pathogens, contain a whole bunch of chemicals that mess with mammalian reproductive systems. Now, plants did not make these chemicals for humans to use as birth control. They make them for totally different reasons. Still, the overlap with mammalian hormones and reproductive science is real and got discovered by human tribes through simple observation and trial and error over massive stretches of time. Somebody noticed something working, they told a friend. This wisdom grew generation after generation through those specific, quiet, informal circles where traditional women's medical wisdom spread. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, Daucus, Coroto, is probably the most famous example of a plant with traditional birth control uses across totally separate cultures. Even wild carrot seeds got mentioned by Hippocrates in the 5th century BC as a birth control option, and people kept using them for herbal medicine in parts of South Asia even today. Today, scientists have actually found that wild carrot seeds contain active compounds that mess with how progesterone is made to stop implantation. Plus, animal studies showed these anti-fertility effects. Now, is it actually safe or reliable? Not by today's medical standards. Why? Because the dose you need is dangerously close to what would poison you. Still, it is definitely not useless either. There is real chemistry going on at the biological level when you take them in just the right amounts, which is more than we can say for most of the bizarre cures used throughout the ancient world. Then we have silphium, the ultimate example of ancient herbal birth control, but it ends in tragedy because the plant was driven to complete extinction by the massive demand it created. This miraculous herb only grew along a narrow strip of North Africa, right near the ancient Greek city of Cyrene, located in what is now Libya. Famous ancient writers talked about it constantly, from Hippocrates to Theophrastus, Dioscorides, and Pliny the Elder, claiming it had incredible contraceptive and pregnancy-blocking power, and it was so highly valued that it became the main export and economic backbone. For Cyrene, they stamped it on their coins, shipping it across the Mediterranean at insane prices, making it one of the most valuable goods in the whole ancient world. It was worth its weight in pure silver. Records, worth way more than gold to many. This obsession with silphium, mostly fueled by its massive reputation as an ancient birth control, was crazy and relentless that the plant was harvested right into extinction. By the 1st century CE, it was gone. The last surviving stock was reportedly sent to the Emperor Nero as a sheer novelty. Ancient writers described it with such detail and consistency. They listed doses, how to use it, the effects, and the difference between its contraceptive and abortive applications at different dosages. That really suggests this reputation was based on real, proven results, not just pure superstition or clever marketing. What active compounds it had, and exactly how they worked is something we can never solve, simply because the plant no longer exists. A whole species was basically driven into oblivion by the sheer demand of its own high usefulness. That is a highly specific, almost poetic kind of tragedy. Pennyroyal, Artemisia plants, pomegranate seeds, juniper berries, blue cohosh, wild ginger, cotton root, bark, across Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, Native American, and African traditional healing. These specific plants are consistently written about for disrupting human fertility, preventing or ending pregnancy entirely, and modern scientific research on these plants actually confirms that they do contain active chemicals that impact key reproductive hormones, implantation, or uterine functions, though their safety and effectiveness vary enormously. Some of those traditional herbs actually worked by poisoning the mother to a point that also ended the pregnancy. Sounds pretty terrifying, right? And it was. Even ancient medical writers were fully aware of this and wrote it down, but the science behind it, all this traditional knowledge is real. These wild plants have compounds that seriously impact human reproduction. The ancient Greeks and Romans were incredibly organized about tracking birth control, and surviving records from those eras are by far the most detailed from the ancient world. Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek doctor working in Rome during the 2nd century CE, wrote a gynecology book called Gynikeia, featuring a massive and surprisingly structured guide to preventing and ending pregnancies. His medical logic is surprisingly advanced. For his time, he separates carefully between standard contraceptives, which block fertilization altogether, and abortifacients, which actually end an existing pregnancy, and points out that prevention is better than abortion, both for safety and for the woman's own health. He ranks these ancient methods by how safe and reliable they are, weighing the hard compromises between success rates and physical danger in a way that shows real clinical thinking, instead of just blind herbal optimism. His top recommendations include barrier options like wool sponges soaked in different liquids like olive oil and cedar resin, white lead, and pomegranate pulp, and potions to drink before or after sex. Some of his advice actually makes perfect sense even under modern scrutiny. Olive oil and cedar resin both kill sperm, confirmed by modern science. Pomegranate seeds contain phytoestrogens, natural compounds that mimic estrogen, altering the body's natural hormones in ways that block pregnancy. Now, white lead definitely works at killing everything, including sperm, but it also slowly kills the woman through lead poisoning. Talk about a massive downside, but this doctor seemingly saw it as an acceptable trade-off in some cases. Ancient medicine was never big on what we would consider a proper long-term safety test. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BCE, calls birth control a totally normal practice for Roman women, treating it as totally ordinary and well-known, not some rare medical procedure that casual references. Huge evidence. When a poet treats something as just an ordinary background detail, rather than a major talking point, it means the practice was so common that the audience needed no explanation. The Talmud, the central text of ancient Jewish law written over several centuries, actually goes into detail about birth control in different situations, including explicit mention of a primitive device called a mock, essentially a physical barrier used to block pregnancy, and herbal birth control drinks, often called a cup of roots. This debate was deeply legal and philosophical, not just a medical thing, but it shows they assumed that real birth control actually existed, and the real question was just when it was okay to use. That tells us those ancient methods being debated were known to actually work to some real degree. Why write endless pages of legal debate about when you can use something, especially if that exact thing never actually worked? Physical barriers pop up across several distinct historical cultures in ways that felt like real engineering, solving the exact same problem. Beyond the famous Egyptian pessaries and the Greek or Roman wool inserts, ancient texts also point to things that functioned exactly like our modern-day condoms, protective sheaths for men used during intimacy. Ancient Egyptians apparently used these linen sheaths, maybe to prevent disease, as much as preventing pregnancy. But those two ideas aren't mutually exclusive. Ancient Japanese records also show similar protective gear made from tortoise shells and later animal intestines. That sounds incredibly uncomfortable, doesn't it? It explains why these early barrier methods were so heavily avoided, despite how well they actually worked, and Rome even turned to goat bladders. For that very purpose, the concept was clear to different cultures, even if their creative designs were wildly different. The famous pulling out method appears so consistently across old cultures and eras that it needs no ancient instruction manual to prove it existed. Even the Bible mentions it in the famous story of Onan, which actually gave us its oldest name. Early doctors wrote about it as a totally normal habit. We find it in almost every traditional culture ever studied all over the world. Does it actually prevent pregnancy? Sure, but not perfectly. Today, data shows it cuts risk by about 73% if you do it right, which basically tells you everything about how hard that is to pull off in reality. But hey, it is free, easy, requires zero prep work, so its popularity across all of human history makes perfect sense. Breastfeeding, which naturally stops a mother from ovulating, was likely the most common ancient family planning tool, but calling it a method makes it sound way more deliberate and calculated than it actually was for those ancient mothers. Extended nursing naturally blocks the chemical signals that start ovulation in groups where nursing was constant and prolonged, like in most old-school societies, sometimes until the kid was 2 or 3. This naturally spaced out the pregnancies without any extra effort. Did our ancestors actually understand the science behind it, or just notice that nursing prevented pregnancy? Delay the next pregnancy is pretty hazy, but the hands-on proof would have been obvious to anyone paying attention, living in the tribe over time, and they would have been right. Some ancient cultures actually seem to have intentionally kept breastfeeding going, at least partly for natural birth control, rather than just for nutritional health reasons. The real-world evidence from modern indigenous tribes includes clear quotes from women about using breastfeeding to delay the next baby. Whether this understanding is truly ancient or a recent buildup of shared tribe wisdom is impossible to prove for sure, but that biological lock is as old as breastfeeding itself, and noticing it has probably been around just as long. Holding off on intimacy during certain times of the menstrual cycle shows up in old medical and sacred texts as a way of managing family size. This idea of a fertile window, the exact time you can get pregnant, was well known throughout ancient medical history, even if the actual math was totally wrong. Hippocrates thought women were most fertile right after their period ended, which is actually the absolute safest time in the whole cycle. So, early attempts at the rhythm method were basically practiced at the absolute wrong time, giving couples little to no actual birth control benefit while offering a false sense of security. The real window of ovulation, right mid-cycle, about 2 weeks before their fertility cycle, was completely misunderstood until the 20th century. For almost all of human history, before 1930, if you tried to track your cycle for birth control, you were relying on advice that was not just flawed, but totally wrong. On the absolute key details, the why did birth control matter so much in ancient times, the truth deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because preventing a pregnancy back then was never just a personal choice. It was tied to rigid social rules that made having kids weighted differently for different folks in different situations. In ancient Rome, enslaved women had the most desperate and urgent need for reliable birth control. For them, a pregnancy meant a child born into slavery, and the harsh reality of constant abuse made an unwanted pregnancy there an everyday threat rather than some distant nightmare. Free women faced different, but still heavy pressures. Marriage was often an economic and political alliance, and producing heirs was the primary expectation of the union. Period. But too many kids would drain family wealth, and having babies under unapproved circumstances, since adultery was a major legal crime under strict Roman laws, made controlling pregnancy an absolute practical necessity, not a choice. So, which women actually had access to this secret contraceptive knowledge and the absolute best reasons, and who used it most consistently. Those working the sex trade, the heterae of ancient Greece, the women who worked Roman brothels, which were legal, regulated, and taxed, hubs of daily city life. These women had the most urgent reason to seek out contraception, and the most constant need for secrets that actually worked. Some researchers even argue that the passing down of this vital birth control knowledge across ancient cultures is thanks to this specific group, and not formal medical tradition, simply because their daily need was incredibly urgent and real, life-altering. So, what is the big picture we get from all this? Our ancestors tried incredibly hard to control their fertility, just like us. They did it in every culture. During every era we have records of using whatever plant knowledge and raw materials they could find. How well did it work? Well, their success rate varied quite a bit. From surprisingly effective methods like breastfeeding and pulling out, to moderately effective spermicidal mixtures and physical barriers, to the real but highly unpredictable herbal drinks, all the way to pure placebos like Lucky Charms. This wisdom was mostly held and shared by women quite informally, passed down to their daughters, and whispered among local community members. It was rarely written down the way elite male medical knowledge always was, meaning this practical wisdom is largely missing from our historical records, even though it was practiced way more than surviving scrolls ever show. Soranus of Ephesus wrote things down, but the caring grandmother who told her family which local plants to brew into tea never did. And honestly, when we look at what people actually did back then, that oral history was likely much more common and far more useful. But the massive gap between what people wanted, reliable, safe control over pregnancy, and what they could actually get, was just a messy mix of questionable methods and total guesswork over which ones really worked and why. Was a massive divide that lasted through almost all of human history. It was only solved by the modern hormonal birth control in the mid-20th century. Yet the primal urge driving that scientific breakthrough was not new. It was not born from recent sexual liberation. It was right there in the crocodile dung mixtures of Egypt, the historic silphium trade across the Mediterranean, and the herbal secrets that women quietly shared within every single traditional culture ever studied on every inhabited continent. This intense drive to enjoy sex without having kids, and the willingness to take terrifying risks and use whatever sketchy means they had to get it, is as old as the primal drive for sex itself, which is honestly about as old as time.